Greetings, YouTube. It's Bowspira, the weirdest guy on YouTube and possibly the internet. And today I'm unfortunately recording a really raw one on my mobile because my laptop's out of action. So this is going to be a lot rougher than my usual rough videos. I really am going to have to start working on upping the quality of these sooner or later. But for now, this will do. I just wanted to touch base on the whole orcs are racist drama. I do think that there is a point in there, but I also think that the people pushing this argument have things completely backwards and their argument is based on a severe fallacy. Furthermore, if their argument is indeed based on academic research, then the peer-reviewed journal that has pushed it seriously needs to review its peer reviewers. So I just wanted to touch on something here firstly and bring up something. I'm not sure how many people here are aware of something called social Darwinism. So, at the dawn of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, the eugenics movement had heavily come into power and had heavily come into social prominence, I should say. And around this time, too, people were becoming aware of a lot of parts of the world where people weren't necessarily white, indigenous races, etc. Places like Africa, for example, which is the great unknown. And in fact, social Darwinism arguably goes back to about the 1700s even. And it was the theory that white people evolved from a certain group of apes and different people, different races of humans evolved from different primates. Well, actually it got weirder and wackier the further out people went into quote unquote the new world. To the point where some of the descriptions of indigenous peoples in different places got really weird. And to the point where they would push that the animals that supposedly those people evolved from were so radically different from people. But basically, it was an argument that essentially said that people of other races were different species to white people, therefore they were animals and not humans. And it was something that has pushed a lot of colonialism, for example, did push this. You see it with how First Nations people in the US were treated. You see it how Indigenous Australians were treated. You see it even with things like slavery, for example, in the US with the whole issue with black slavery. Not to say that slavery hasn't gone on elsewhere, but those attitudes were driving it. Case in point, Indigenous Australians were classified as animals rather than people. They fell under, I think it was the Fauna and Flora Act in Australian law. So there is definitely this. And the kind of language that was used is basically the kind of language that you saw with the descriptions of orcs. And it's the kind of language that you have seen with fantasy races. I think the reason that they've picked up on orcs, though, is because orcs are essentially described as a savage race. And so it does have those parallels, those calls back to the notion of indigenous people being quote unquote savages. And I think that's where they're coming from with it. However, while the parallels are definitely there, the argument is, and my phone is so wacky I can't switch tabs, so I'm going to have to look down and look at what I wrote. The particular fallacy that they're going off is known as a cum hoc ergo propter hoc, which translates to with this, therefore, because of this. It's a questionable cause logical fallacy. Basically, the argument here is that because D&D and Tolkien's writings came after colonialism, therefore that must be where the tradition lies. That seems to be it. With the way they're arguing, it echoes colonialism. But the argument that it echoes colonialism is historical revisionism, because it pretends that colonialism is where these literary traditions came from, and they didn't. As people have pointed out, the notion of orcs goes back to, I think it's Beowulf, which was written something like the 8th or 9th century, which is well before this. And the notions of these creatures, for example, it's no different how aliens are depicted in science fiction. Let's take Star Trek, for example, with the Klingons, the Vulcans, the Betazoids, the Ferengi, Romulans, although technically they are Vulcans. I forget, there are a few other races, Binars, There are several races in Star Trek. Babylon 5, which obviously you have the Narn, the Minbari, the Volons. Why is it that I'm forgetting the alien races of my favorite series right when I'm recording this? On the other hand, you have races like the Chiss and the Twi'leks and the Hutts, for example, in Star Wars. Again, all of these are different alien races looking completely different to us, coming from different planets. Well, in the fantasy tradition, of course, often they come from different realities, different dimensions, or it might be a parallel evolution of two different races on the one planet, the one realm, the one world, the one planet that evolved from completely different evolutions. I'm trying to think of the race, but Doctor Who, for example, had an example of this with not the Silurians. I don't think it was. Someone can correct me on that. The reptilian humanoids. Doctor Who that evolved from dinosaurs, where we've evolved from mammals, and they were the same race. In fact, Star Trek did a similar thing, where there were reptile-based humanoids that left the planet. They lived in the Delta Quadrant, and they considered it heresy that they came from Earth. Even in sci-fi, you have these examples. Now, that in itself is not racist. That in itself is just an alien race, an alien realm. Now, you can certainly argue that social Darwinism took the traditions, manipulated them, and used them for something very evil, something very malevolent, to dehumanize non-white people, and in doing so to subject intolerable cruelty on them. But the problem I see with this argument is, firstly, it ignores where the roots from this come from. Tolkien wasn't adapting social Darwinism. He was well and truly working within a literary trait with fantasy that predated social Darwinism by a good 900 to 1,000 years. And it was a literary tradition that, if anything, social Darwinism had taken and manipulated. Now, the problem I see with this is forgetting about the fact that this completely puts the cart before the horse in terms of how it's viewed things. What is this essentially doing with that literary tradition? If it's saying that we can't touch it, we can't go there, because racists, because the very eugenics lobby that supported Hitler claimed it and hijacked it, then aren't you allowing them to lay claim to it? Aren't you treating that as cultural territory that has been surrendered to white supremacists, that has been surrendered to the likes of the Nazis? Why aren't we taking it back? Why aren't we saying, yes, social Darwinists manipulated it for evil. They took a proud literary tradition from 1,000 years ago, if not longer, that if anything should unite us, and they twisted it, and now we're taking it back. Shouldn't we be doing that? Rather than saying, well, the racists have taken it, they can have it? How is that combating racism? How is giving racists, white supremacists, a foothold in culture, just handing them over one of the oldest literary traditions and one of the oldest genres in history, in modern history at the very least? How is that anything remotely close to combating racism? If anything, it's aiding and abetting racism. It's saying, okay, you've licked the pickle, it's yours. You've licked the window, you've licked the property, you've licked the house. We're going to vacate it. You can have it. Here are the keys. Take it, and by all means, feel emboldened to take every other house in the street, then the suburb, then the city, and so on and so forth. If the culture wars are about ending racism, then it should be about claiming literary traditions back from racists rather than handing them to racists on a silver platter. By demonizing not only Tolkien, but D&D writers as racist for using a literary tradition which had been hijacked by racists, you are giving that literary tradition to racists. That isn't fighting white supremacism, it's aiding and abetting it. Until next time, folks, be kind to each other. You deserve it.